Hi, so welcome to my talk, Beyond Retirement, Finding a New Way to Be, Transition, Role, Identity and Mental Health in North Wales. That's my name and that is my contact address, so you'll have that on the slides if you want to talk afterwards. So who am I as a researcher? Well, my background was general nursing, paediatrics and health visiting. I did a lot of work with crews and trained in systemic family therapy. But reflexively, what's really interesting is that I have retired and returned myself. So having had left the health service as a health visitor for many, many years, I came back as a counselling student. So why was I attracted to the subject of studying retirement in an in-depth way? Well, I've always been fascinated by lived experiences, and I'm very aware of the impacts of retirement on mental well-being. I've done it myself, and I've been around other people who've gone through that transition. I've also worked with a lot of older people throughout my career, and I've seen many different responses to the challenges of aging. I am more drawn to qualitative than quantitative research, and I like detailed analysis of personal narrative. And way back many years ago, I did a small qualitative study, which did influence my practice. Here is my abstract. I won't read through it. Obviously, you can come back to that to get the context afterwards if you wish to. So I'd like to just briefly touch on a little bit of research findings in this area. I've broken it down into the four categories: the role, Erickson and Erickson. Erickson was a brilliant psychologist who talked a lot about various stages of the life cycle, including the final stage of life, the life completed, and he had a positive view of the challenges, but simple rewards of that age of life. In the identity section, the references I've picked here are all about gender identity, which does influence the choices people make in retirement. So if I was only going to look at one, I'd probably look at the Abassi one there. For transition, we have Zaidi, who looked at the life transitions and the vulnerabilities of old age. Talked a lot about active aging, resilience and coping strategies, which is very relevant for counselling. And then in the retirement section, I'll just mention Lifton. Brilliant book, The Protean Self, Human Resilience in an Age of Fragmentation, talking about the kind of society we live in now and how fragmented we've all got from one another. We move around for work, various reasons, and we don't necessarily live where our connections are. So that's an interesting thing to study. I'm coming now to the relevant research specific to Wales in a retiree or related others, i.e. friends and family, counselling context. There is a limited amount of work in this area, but I'll just mention maybe the one I'll flag up most is the What Matters to You, Age Cymru 25. I highly commend this report because it was commissioned by Age Concern at the time, Age Cymru, to really talk to older persons post-retirement across the country. What were their lives like? What did they enjoy? How was their digital competency? What did they miss? How was their access to medical services? What were their social connections? So it's a very useful person-led report, that. With the Johns et al. 21, very interestingly, it talks about remote counselling and how that got born in the NHS during COVID, because all of a sudden people couldn't get face-to-face contacts and they were struggling. So the service had to adapt very quickly with online counselling. And actually, they found when they looked at it that many people preferred that because it meant they could access from home, they didn't have to pay expenses to get there, and they could have it at a time of their choosing. With Anthony et al., they looked at the social and financial benefits of preventative and timely counselling in the elderly around sight loss. So I'd encourage you to look at that one because, you know, it's a good basis for preventative counselling, for getting things, nipping things, looking at analysing things early on, not just several years down the line where the struggles are there, but trying to look at coping strategies fairly early on. So we'll just briefly touch on the demographics in North Wales. We are a devolved country and we have had very different health and social care context, which makes it an interesting place to do a study. You can see from the figures that currently we've got 866,000 plus people over 60 living in Wales. That's quite a lot. Projected to be over 1 million by 2031, which will be 31% of the population. So if we're in the counselling game, we will be working with people in this age group. We're in a time of flux with retirement. There's a rising pension age and the retire and return option is increasingly commonplace. And since the Health and Wellbeing Act in 2014, there have been rapid developments in interagency partnership working. I just list a couple here. In our area, we've got ICANN and Welsh Government. As I say, voluntary and statutory services coming together in a preventative way, rather than waiting until things get to secondary mental health care services, trying to act early. And there's money going into things like the third sector, including Mind. So let's look now at our research questions. What is the nature of the study we did? Obviously, we got the ethical approval, but the questions we wanted to consider were, how does personal identity change after retirement? And how does the role transition of retirement affect mental health? Our study was qualitative, it was inductive, and it used the Braun and Clarke's classic 2006 six-stage process. Our sample was a convenience sample. We aimed to recruit 18 people. We actually interviewed 11, and we were able to study the transcripts of 10 of those. The interviews had additional prompts to gather rich data for the thematic analysis. The interviews lasted between 3/4 of an hour and an hour, and they were delivered online. The participants had to have retired or returned within the last decade in Wales. They could be of any gender or ethnicity. So our recruitment took place with posters all over the place, shops, health centres, social centres, libraries, faith groups, posts on social media, and of course word of mouth. Respondents who were interested received a demographic questionnaire on the side toolkit, and to confirm the things we've said. They also had to not have a diagnosis of dementia, not because we weren't interested in those narratives. We would have been very interested, but the complexities in a small scale student time limited study just made that impossible, because you'd have to involve different ethics, different carers groups, advocacy and all of that, and we just didn't have the capacity for that. Once the consents were gained, interviews were scheduled online. We worked in pairs with one interviewer asking the questions and a seconder on standby in case of any difficulties or the need to contact the supervisor, who was always available. At the end of the interviews, we got together online just to make sure that protocol had been followed, and if there were any issues, it was taken to supervision. This gives you a breakdown of the people we were able to analyse their transcripts. As you can see, the majority were from Conwy, and we had a smattering from Gwynedd, Flintshire and Wrexham, but no participants from elsewhere in Wales. The gender balance wasn't great. We had 90% female, 10% male. Wasn't for want of trying. We had quite a lot of interest from the men, but they didn't follow through. 50% of the group had retired and returned, which backed up what I was saying earlier. So, what did we learn? What were my themes that I developed from the analysing intensively the transcripts? Theme number 1, negotiating the transition into retirement. In the study, I've looked at push and pull factors. What makes someone want to retire? Sometimes it could be poor health. Other times it could be I've come into an inheritance, I don't have to work anymore. Other times it could be I just can't stand this job anymore. Or sometimes it might be an enforced transition, a redundancy, or a move that has to be done for social reasons. It was critical how ready the participants were for their retirement. Had they had the chance to plan and prepare? There's a lot to be said about having personal autonomy on that decision, but we live in a very fast-moving world, so for some people it's forced upon them. Ill health and bereavement were often factors, and as I say, some of the transitions were voluntary and others were enforced. Theme 2, identity reconfiguration after retirement. And here, from the quotes I analysed, I was looking at significant losses versus continuity. Losses included missing my colleagues, missing the amount of money I had, missing the routine and structure of life, missing the value I was contributing. Continuity was, actually, I've got skills I can use beyond this job. And in fact, I've got skills that I can use in the voluntary sector, perhaps, or in my grandparenting, or I've always wanted to travel, but I've not been able to, and now I can. So, loss versus continuity. And the key theme that was coming out was social identity, feeling valued. This seemed to come up over and over again, wanting to feel useful, wanting to be seen, and wanting to be of value. So, in terms of mental health, I mean, all of those factors affect mental health. But what my sub-themes here? Vulnerability, the things we've said, loneliness perhaps, disorientation, confusion, existentially not knowing who I am anymore, versus enhanced well-being. And in this cohort, we had a very happy cohort because most of them actually felt that their mental well-being had been enhanced quite considerably. Yes, there were the issues, but they were generally loving being able to do what they wanted when they wanted. They were loving the freedom to make decisions. They were loving, they would sometimes get in touch with their colleagues and hear what was going on in the workplace and think, oh, I'm glad I'm out of that. Some of them were sleeping a lot better. Some were enjoying spending more time with their family and so forth. So some vulnerability and some enhanced well-being. The job they were having was to make meaning and to reconstruct their own narratives. So working out who am I now and taking parts of what they were before and making something new sometimes as well. We had one participant who actually found herself, she'd always considered herself an introvert previously, but with all the social groups she was now attending, she was actually finding herself quite popular with a lot more friends than before. So this was a new narrative for her. So discussion. Were we replicating existing research or did we find anything new? Well, we did back up the existing research and we found that being able to prepare and plan for retirement was foundationally vital. Preparing financially, a lot of the people did speak to financial advisors and things like that, but none of them had been to groups or therapy or anything like that. Financial security allowed them choice, and having choices enhances well-being. This is what they were saying. You know, if they didn't have enough money, they couldn't go on holiday, they couldn't do the activities they wanted to do. But in this particular cohort, most of them were being able to make the choices they want. Some of them were cautious about money. Some were in that bit in between the general work pension and the state pension kicking in, and they were kind of looking forward to having a bit more when that did. Having agency about when and how they retired was key. So the ones who'd had it forced upon them were struggling more than the ones who'd planned it. Evidence of gender difference. We did have mainly women in the group, and 3 of those were very keen to retire, partly to join their older partners and have that valued time together. There was a sense of mortality raising its head. You know, how much longer will we have and who do I want to spend that time with? Do I want to be in the workplace or do I want to be with the people I love the most? And that backed up some of the studies I mentioned earlier. Previous research showed that anxiety can peak coming into retirement, and that had been the case for some of our participants. In terms of the higher levels of depression that have been identified a decade or so after retirement, we didn't really hit that because ours hadn't been retired that long, so we didn't really see that. We did notice the honeymoon period that has been described in the literature. You know, lots of holidays and catching up with everybody, and then there's the kind of, well, what do I do now? So disorientation and a search for new structure, recalibration of role identity, and a sense of new sense of purpose, and people had been very creative around the sorts of volunteering, activities, informal help for people, all sorts of things. If you read the study, you'll see the kind of things they were doing. Theme that came out over and over again was wanting to exercise, looking after physical health, having regular activity, and having social connection was absolutely vital. But as I say, our cohort were remarkably content, and many spoke about the geographical context as being of great value for their mental well-being. So that's unique to our area. They hadn't sought counselling, preferring much more to talk to friends and family. So strengths and limitations and suggestions for future research. Strengths. The study was safely managed and closely supervised. It did, as we hoped, provide rich narratives for analysis. And it showed real insight into the importance of informal mental health support as opposed to formal support systems. Limitations, well, digital exclusion. Unfortunately, we had to do our study online for logistical reasons. So we know in Wales that up to 10% of the population are not digitally literate or have the equipment. So they weren't on our study. So it wasn't representative that way. Most of our participants came through word of mouth, which would have skewed the sample, and 90% of them were female, which was disappointing. Future research suggestions. I'd like to see more qualitative studies in other parts of Wales reflecting a wider social and geographic diversity. I'd like to see a longitudinal study to follow a Welsh retiree cohort over a longer period of time, particularly from retirement, then maybe 2 years into the retirement, 5 years, 10 years, to really analyse a long-term cohort and perhaps look at purposive rather than convenience sampling. This way, you could look at particular ethnic groups, particular gender, particular social class. You could really hone in on those things. So, what's the relevance of all this to counsellors and therapists and wellbeing services? Well, we've synthesised a big literature review on identity, role, and transition, which is all worth reading. I recommend. We did offer a rich thematic analysis. I'd like to say we were raising the awareness of issues around the increasingly ageing population in Wales as discussed. By reading around this subject, we'd know more how to support our retiree clients and their associated friends and family, because it's not just the retiree who's affected by this massive transition, it's everyone around them. Having this empathy and understanding will increase your therapeutic alliance in this age group. I'm emphasising the need as a takeaway for contemporary social prescribing and advocacy for this group. There's an awful lot out there, but often people are isolated. And if I was to say one thing, it would be perhaps we should be targeting our counselling at the more vulnerable end of the market. You know, there are a lot of very happy, quite wealthy retirees out there that probably aren't the most needy of services, although of course everyone's entitled to them. But what about the ones who've had an abrupt and sudden retirement? What about the ones who've recently been bereaved of a partner coming into retirement? They're much more vulnerable and should really be hopefully supported. And finally, the transferable skill of understanding how role and identity affect mental health has got application to other life transitions. Here are some key references on the next 2 slides for you to take away. And I'd just like to say thank you so much for listening. And if you've got any further questions, reflections, thoughts that you would like to share, or you'd like to read the study in full, or have the extended list of references, which is lengthy, please contact me directly. Here's my Bangor email until July. And after July, there's my personal email and my telephone number. And I'd love to have a conversation with you if you found this interesting. And thank you so much for listening.